Julia, I appreciate you talking with us today. With you being the VP of Revenue Operations for Electric, when you go through your planning season and you're rolling out your go-to-market and you realize, hey, I need to do a mid-year shift in my operational planning, how does it you identify that need and go about it?
It varies, right? It depends on what's happening in the company, but the biggest indicator that you need maybe a mid-year operational plan reset is when there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of where you might land at the end of the year, because things have changed so much from the time that you had started operational planning, likely in December of the year previous, some cases even October of the year previous. And you just feel like there are things that are happening that you just can't wrap your arms around, whether it's from a forecasting perspective, from an operational process perspective, from an enablement perspective, and even, listening to your team. I think that's the biggest indicator too. If your team or the people who are on the floor, right, your AEs, your CSMs, are all consistently telling you this message that, they just don't know what's going on, and it seems like there's a mismatch, there's a misalignment as to what they're feeling and what they've been put, what goals have been put in front of them. And so that's a really great indicator. The combination of the fact that, what assumptions you made when you started this whole operational planning adventure the year previous and where you're at today, and then also hearing that feedback from your team or the teams around you that you might be supporting because of the fact that there has been a ton of change. And I think change is inevitable, right? With every single company that you're at. And I think at a minimum, even if you don't have those signals from a senior leadership perspective, it is in your best interest to just regroup as a senior leadership team around the mid-year point to say, how are we doing? Let's do a look back in the first half of the year. Is there a quick retro we could do just to assess, one, are we, halfway through the plan in actuality? If not, okay, well, how can we get there? Or if things are vastly different, what can we do to prepare our teams, to prepare the company, to prepare, all the things, all those moving parts, right? So that we can move together and make the end of the year successful. Because I think the worst thing you can do is acknowledge that things are not where you want it to be and then do nothing about it. So that's how I think about mid-year operational planning.
When I look at mid-year operational planning, I always think of, that you do your go-to-market in the beginning of the year. It always feels like no matter how early you start, you always feel super rushed when you get down to the finish line and you're trying to implement all your go-to-market changes, right? If you were to give advice to any other revenue operations leaders about putting some KPIs or metrics in place for when they roll out their go-to-market or their operational plan to identify areas where, possible failure could be occurring in the operational plan that can help identify whether or not like a mid-year shift should be appropriate. Do you have any metrics or KPIs that you use that help you identify that?
Yeah, I mean, there are always metrics associated with the goals that you have, right? And so hopefully you're looking at those metrics week over week. But sometimes when you are that tactical, right, looking at these metrics week over week, you may not see the change as drastically, right? Because the change week over week might be slight. And so it is, again, is kind of that process where you have to kind of lift your head up out of the sand and kind of take a peek around. And so that's why thinking about things at the end of the quarter is really important. One of the things that we've done in the past is when we reach the, sort of like almost end of quarter, about like 2 or 3 weeks before the end of the quarter, we'll say, okay, well, number one, what can we do to make the end of this quarter really, really successful, right? Is the end of quarter push. But also, like, how is this quarter going, right? And I think it's this constant touch point of revisiting those metrics, not just week over week, but quarter over quarter, and then kind of like, halfway through the year. And using that as the measurement, right? Because you could add a lot of different data, but I think it's that consistency and seeing that pattern over time that is the important piece. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, like some of the ones that I'm always looking at are early stage indicators, right? So I try to look at, monthly and quarterly, like you mentioned, rather than, weekly. And I look at, pipe gen, I think is a really good indicator as well. Like keeping an eye on like pipeline generation, bookings, obviously, right? And then revenue. And then, another one that I really like is behavioral metrics. So understanding if the climate of the reps are that they've given up, right? If you notice indicators of a loss of hope, where productivity or activities such as number of calls, number of emails, things like that slow down, that's something that's an output, not an input. And so therefore it kind of pulls out economic factors from the formula, right? If like the success rate of something, it's more or less like, is the team motivated? Are they doing the activities that really drive those end results? Are there any favorites that you have out of any of the metrics for identifying the need for a mid-year change?
Yeah, actually, you give up, you bring up a really good point around these behavioral indicators. Um, One thing that Electric does really well is we do regular employee surveys. And it's not just, targeted at, sales or some of the go-to-market teams. It's across the entire org, but it is broken up into the different go-to-market teams. So you can drill down and say, what is the overall sentiment for sales? What is the overall sentiment for marketing and such? But I think something like that is just a nice overlay, right? Because those questions are a little bit broader. And sometimes, I mean, all surveys have that problem where, in that moment in time when you're filling out that survey, you might have a certain feeling, right? Like it's either a positive feeling or a negative feeling. And it could be highly influenced by how your day is going. But it is helpful to see if there's an upward trend in that employee survey or a downward trend, hopefully not a downward trend. And our ENPS does a really great job of also having these open-ended questions where people can fill in their thoughts and comments and anything they want to share that's not specifically a question in the survey. And so I think that's just a really nice way to take a look at it holistically and think about those behavioral indicators that you're saying, because, for someone like me, I do get very caught up in the more traditional metrics, right? And so I think that's a really great point that you raised, Darren.
Yeah, when you're doing your change and you're looking at okay, you've decided you're making a change mid-year, how are you identifying whether or not it's going to be a big change or a small change, and how do you design, how big of an impact it should have on the business right now, and whether you should pull back some of the changes and hold it for the next year, or whether you do it all at one time?
It is definitely a conversation that needs to be had with multiple people. And the reason why I say that is because revenue operations needs to be aligned with sales, needs to be aligned with marketing, needs to be aligned with customer success, needs to be aligned with business development or partnerships. And so, as much as I could say, yes, we absolutely need to deprioritize that from a RevOps perspective, these are the reasons why. But in reality, it really is a conversation that needs to be had across all the go-to-market teams that you're supporting, or in that specific area that you're kind of aligned with that corresponding go-to-market team. And so I think that it's really important to remember that we're not working in a silo. I think this is a comment that often comes from RevOps teams. You always often feel like you're working in a silo, or you're trying to support these go-to-market teams and they're kind of doing their own thing and you're maybe surprised by something that's going on. It's a really great time for one, really establishing those relationships, both with that go-to-market team's leadership and then also the people who are in that go-to-market team, because it's reinforcing the fact that you are there to really help support their operational processes, their tech stack, get them the data they need so they can do their jobs effectively and provide value. And also, it's also a great time for you to be that advisor. I think that's one of the hardest things about being in RevOps. You're always trying to balance that tactical, getting things done, checking off all of those projects, making sure you're hitting those timelines, but also be that advisor to those teams to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing, and here's my guidance, or here's what I'm suggesting, because it's a lot. There's always a lot happening. And so when I think about this mid-year operational planning, I think of it in that way. Yes, there are probably things that I would love to deprioritize, but it's a conversation, and maybe you can convince your, counterpart to say, oh yeah, no, I see it. And actually, this is my new priority. And you have that clear directive or information from that particular go-to-market team you're working with, or you convince them that maybe that's something that they need to kind of consider or think about or prioritize. So I see it as an opportunity to have a conversation and also really build that muscle of being that strategic advisor.
We've talked a lot about updating the operational plans based on internal data, right? Like pipeline generation, bookings, employee NPS. Is there ever a time that you've updated the operational plan due to an outside factor, like a major shift in macroeconomic trends or a big competitive threat or anything like that?
Yes and no. Obviously, as much as, as a company, you should be very much aware of what's happening in the market. You should be aware of what your competitors are doing. You should
Yeah.
be aware of, how your sales and how your product is fitting in the market. You also don't want to be, like a leaf in the wind, right? Like you don't want to be, switching strategies every time something changes out in the world. Because at the core of it, the assumption is that you trust the process that you put in place in order to do operational planning, and you trust the goals, the visions. In our case, we use OKRs, the objectives, the results that you're trying to seek. And you trust that not only are you using a process that works for your company, but that all the other people who are supporting your company, your board members, your advisors, they are also, checking in with you. You're having your regular board meetings that are them saying, hey, we agree with this plan. We love it. We can't wait to see what comes out of this plan, right? And so if you are really reacting to what's happening in the market regularly and letting it really influence your internal kind of workings and your internal strategy and plan in a regular way, I think it can be very disruptive to the internal teams. I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback, especially when there's change in an organization, is everyone's like, I don't know what I'm doing, or I feel there's a lot of uncertainty and, I'm nervous. And so I think part of running a RevOps team is trying to almost alleviate some of that change, because some of that change can be absorbed in slight changes in process. Some of that change could be absorbed by automations and technology, right? Some of that change, you can kind of reduce the impact of change, but unless it's something really dire like a pandemic, right? Obviously, that was so significant that every single company had to make adjustments. There was just a very different way of working at that time. And oftentimes, for those companies where you had a lot of in-person customers, or there was like a lot of in-person interactions because someone had to literally walk into your store and you didn't have that as an option anymore, yes, absolutely, you have to pivot, change your strategy. Probably everyone was all hands on deck in terms of operational planning. But when it comes to, oh, there's an upcoming Fed meeting. Actually, there was a Fed meeting this week, right? You really shouldn't be drastically changing your strategy, because if you are, then you might have maybe done it wrong to begin with.
That makes sense. What is mid-year operational planning? What is the, for people in operations, right? This is a standard thing that is done 1 to 2 times a year, but for anybody who's new to it, can you explain what is it, when is it, how is it done, and what RevOps's role is in it?
Yes, definitely. It varies from company to company in the sense that if you're a smaller company, you don't have to do something as formal as what we do at Electric. But typically happens end of Q2, more likely beginning of Q3 is the timing for mid-year operational plan or planning sessions. Typically involves the go-to-market teams and finance. Finance usually has a really big component in this mid-year operational planning. It can be run or hosted by finance sometimes. Sometimes it's led by RevOps if you have maybe a smaller team. Sometimes it's led by sometimes they're kind of like PMOs or other operational teams that overlay all of the go-to-market teams, and it could be led by that organization. Sometimes it's called the Center of Excellence. And so it depends on your org structure, but usually there is one team that sort of tasks in coordinating everyone, getting all the materials. And it starts by gathering all the information around what you had put together for your original operational plan, because you need to kind of see what did we originally say we were going to do, and then where are we at today. So there's a lot of report pulling, a lot of like, okay, we need a dashboard around this. And so the RevOps team usually takes a pretty big part in gathering that data and making sure we have the right data. It's also looking at different components. It might be, okay, what are those non-comp costs or expenses that we've been spending our money on that we might want to pull back on or maybe invest more in. So that was something that I did recently where we looked at the software stack that we have today, and with the ones that were coming up for renewal, the question was, do we actually really need this tool? Or did we find other tools more beneficial, and so we want to maybe expand our footprint in those tools? Or maybe, or in our case, our sales team or our sales leadership needed a way to better manage their sales team. They wanted to be able to coach the AEs better because they were seeing, some activities drop off a little bit. They weren't seeing as many follow-up meetings, and it was just really hard for them. There were reports and dashboards that they were looking at, but it'd be much easier if we had a mechanism or a tool that was going to allow them to do that coaching in a more straightforward way. So it was thinking about, okay, how much budget do we need for a tool like that if we were to add that in the second half of the year? So thinking about things like tech expenses, non-comp expenses is a part of operational planning. And that's usually the easiest, right? Because you kind of know what those things are. Same thing for marketing teams. Marketing teams tend to have a lot of non-comp expenses, so they have to kind of think about what is their ad budget. What are they doing? Social channels are working successfully for them. So how much budget do they want to allocate to LinkedIn versus Reddit versus some other social media channel? And once you kind of get that done, you then have to think about your resources. Are you appropriately staffed for the second half of the year? It may be that because of some changes in volume in the number of leads that are coming in, maybe you need some additional SDRs. Maybe because of the complexity of your product or the types of questions you're kind of consistently hearing in sales meetings, you might want to add a sales engineer or a sales consultant along with your AE. So you have to kind of think about your resources and who you might need or unfortunately not need in the second half of the year, and or ways to reallocate the people on your team, because there's always an option where maybe someone is really, really kind of struggling because there's just a lot going on, but it's a short-term thing. For example, we were thinking about transitioning from one marketing automation platform to another. So our marketing ops person would likely need a little bit more support during that time, but it's not a permanent thing, right? And so you have to think about, how do I redeploy my resources in order to optimize the second half of the year? And then really thinking about what are our objectives? Are the metrics and are the results that we had, set at the beginning of the year appropriate for the second half of the year? Do we need to adjust it because maybe interest in a particular product line is a little soft, but surprisingly, there's a lot more interest in this other channel. So do we, maybe increase the targets around that particular channel and maybe decrease the targets around the channel that's a little bit softer? Thinking about, this was another really great thing. Our finance teams did such a great job around managing collections and credits and things like that in the first half of the year. The conversation was, should we adjust those targets for our finance team? Because, maybe we were just being a little too conservative, right? And so it's really having those conversations. And again, this is typically done, one, as a leadership team, but then breaking out into smaller teams to focus on very specific areas. So we met as a larger senior leadership team, and then we had a meeting with sales, we had a meeting with marketing, we had a RevOps meeting. And so you kind of go into these smaller breakout discussions and then come back as a larger team. And by the end, essentially, we kind of agree, okay, these are the top 3 priorities. These are our objectives. These are our revised goals. But I think the most important step, once that is done, it's not like, whew, we're done. Check. We won't have to look at this again until the end of the year for, the next year, 2025 planning. You do have to take all of those pieces and then translate that down to your teams, right? So it's taking that strategy and then translating it into tactics so that you can actually execute on those things. And I think that's an area where sometimes we forget to do that part. We're so happy we have a new operational plan that we immediately say, great, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And that's not the case. You do need to say, okay, what is going to change from a day-to-day perspective for the sales team? What is going to change, for the RevOps team and so on?
When somebody identifies that they're going to do a mid-year change, what's some advice that you could give around what type of challenges they could run into and how they could overcome some of those?
Yes, I think a lot of these challenges you can actually be proactive in addressing. So when I say challenges, it's not like there isn't a solution for addressing these, but number one, I think it's being very open and really listening in those discussions. I think that a lot of times when you're doing operational planning, there might be a little bit of friction. Your CEO might say, I want more. I'm excited about seeing more in the second half of the year. And maybe your CS team is like, we're really struggling. We need to retain these customers and we're not getting the support we need. How do we prioritize that? And sales is like, no, let's prioritize sales because, we also want to get more sales coming in the second half of the year. So there's just a natural friction in working with many teams that have different priorities that align with what they're trying to accomplish. And so as a RevOps leader and as a RevOps team, this is a great opportunity to, again, build those relationships. And so the solve for that is to almost be proactive. If you know that there's likely going to be a mid-year operational planning session, or that's something that makes sense given what we had talked about in terms of those indicators, that's when you start having those conversations with those teams. So you can almost, again, be that advocate for CS in saying, yes, we're seeing that the retention numbers are, obviously dipping, and here's some ways that, I suggest that we, align, but also these tactics or these strategies that we're going to take to help support CS also actually benefit AEs because XYZ. Or can we leverage AEs to help support the CSMs in the short term, thereby giving them opportunities to do some upselling or cross-selling or something like that. So I think RevOps can be that advocate to help reduce some of that friction, but you do have to do some of that relationship building ahead of time. And then also the biggest thing that can happen during mid-year planning that can impact the productivity around these working sessions is expectations. People sometimes have very wildly different expectations. And so just being overly communicative, being very obvious about what your assumptions are really important. Being able to say, these are my expectations, what are your expectations, and how can we, meet somewhere in the middle. So I think with expectation setting, again, there's a little bit of homework in trying to understand what are your goals, what are your expectations, what are your assumptions, because your perspective may be very different than another team's perspective. And then I think the other thing too is that a lot of times teams will say, I don't know what to focus on. I know something's not working, but I don't know how to fix it, and I don't know what to focus on. And so that's another big challenge. And I think that's another area where data is really helpful in identifying the areas that may not be working in the way that you expect.
I love what you said there earlier. It reminds me of the book The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. It talks about weighing in to buy in, right? And when you allow somebody to speak and weigh in, it makes it a little bit easier for you to then tailor that communication back to the team to say, hey, this is what's in it for you, right? Because I do like what you're talking about right now. A lot of that successful change comes from people understanding what's in it for them, because people are intrinsically internally motivated. So I really do love what you said there.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of what you just said, you said, whenever there's change, it actually operational planning is all about change management at the end of the day, right? And so we think about operational planning as more of a strategic thing, but it is about change management. It's just aligning on what direction you want to make that change and making sure that those changes, obviously align with the overall goals and strategies of the company. But at the end of the day, it is change management. And so you have to take a similar tactic to, operational planning that you would take with change management. It is absolutely alignment, understanding the assumptions, understanding the risks, understanding dependencies between different things, really allowing people to feel like they're engaged and have a voice in the process so that you're bringing them along. And as you were saying, helping them understand what's in it for them, but also the why. The why is so important. And so being able to articulate that at the senior leader level will then allow the teams themselves to understand what happens. Because if you as a senior leader can't articulate why are we doing something, it's going to be really hard for you to stand in front of your team and say, yes, we're going to totally upend, the process that we've been doing for the last 6 months for this change. Let's go do it. Hooray. They're going to be like, but why? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, everything that you touched on is extremely important to change management. And I think to your earlier point, right? Like a lot of people do create a wonderful plan. And this isn't just for operational planning, but if you go into an executive or senior leadership offsite, right? People love to come out with a massive list of things of here's what we're going to go and do. And as soon as you exit that room and the plan is finalized, everything usually falls apart, right? And it's, as you mentioned, everybody needs to be included, understand why it's happening, how they play a role, and all of the changes that they should be made aware of. And of course, it should be documented somewhere for referenceability. So I think that's a really huge point that you're making, not just for operational planning, but in the way of how to implement successful change at at your company. Do you think in terms of, planning in general, the way that it happens at most organizations can feel really clunky and arduous, and most people are sort of groaning as soon as you're like, all right, it's time to plan, right? Like nobody's pumped. Nobody's pumped. Everybody's like, oh man, I hate RevOps right now. Or I hate finance right now. They're making us do that thing again. Are there ways to make planning a bit more lean, a bit more agile, that you've seen or that you've done successfully that you can talk a bit more about?
Yes, for me, it's a lot of templating, honestly. There are some aspects of operational planning you just can't avoid, just truthfully. And so I have templates that I use to make it easier. I also, I think the natural instinct when you have especially complex operational planning that you anticipate to have 2 hour working sessions or an hour and a half working sessions with everyone you could possibly think of including. And you're absolutely right. People come into these meetings being like, oh no, we're only going to get to the first bullet point. There's like 15 bullet points, and it's going to be, 2 hours, an hour and a half of my life that I'm never going to get back. Absolutely. But what oftentimes is more effective is truly identifying the minimum number of people that need to be involved and allowing them to create almost like a mini tactical team, right? And that's why at Electric we have these breakout groups, because if we are all in it together, it's just going to take forever. And those really, really long meetings are not that productive. And so being able to, I think this comes back to trust. Do you trust your peers? Do you trust your colleagues? Do you trust the people around you to make the best decisions in the area that they own or in the topic of discussion that they have ownership of? And so part of operational planning is trusting that people, if you do take that approach of creating these sort of tactical teams to then come back to the larger team, if you trust people, then you will probably move much more quickly. Because as much as it is important to bring everyone along with you in this journey, there is a point where you have to say, I need to have action. I need momentum. And when you have this situation where you want to create momentum, you can't always bring everyone along. And it's not that they can't get there and you can't provide them a mechanism to get there on their own, but in order to get that momentum, in order to get that velocity so that you can move quickly and make decisions and be able to finish this without people never wanting to do this again, you do have to say, okay, let's trust that these people are going to be able to come up with this answer to this decision, and these people are going to be able to do this so that you can come together and have an effective operational planning strategy.
Yeah. How often, I'm curious, do you iterate on how you go about planning, or is it something that you have set up and let run for a few quarters, seeing how that worked? Like, is there ever a time where you're iterating or changing how you all do that?
Yes, but I think the iterations are quite small, so
Mm.
it's never very drastic. I love retros. I really think retros are such a great tool because when you have a project or when you have something really big like mid-year operational planning, to get that feedback after the fact is just so great because people will say, I really like this, but this was terrible. Can we agree it was terrible and let's not do that again? And so retros are a great way of saying, what should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? And what could we add or what could we change? And so answering those three questions through that retro is a great way of identifying what worked and what you can add and change. And it really, again, shouldn't be drastic. It should be small iterative change, as you were saying, but focusing on less the I think you have to focus less on like the exact process, but maybe it was we didn't include the right people at the right time, right? It may not be the process is basically what I'm saying. It may be the right people weren't in the room, or maybe the assumptions were totally off, right? We had these assumptions, we did the right thing, we followed the right process, we had the right people, we had, the best intentions, but our base assumptions were just wrong. And that just happens. And I think that as much as we are hopeful that operational planning is going to end in some success or some positive change, the reality is you might have done everything right and done the best you can, and it doesn't end up with the results you want. And that's just how life is sometimes. And it doesn't mean that operational planning failed. It just means that that iteration of what you tried didn't work, and thankfully there's another chance to do some more operational planning so that you can change your tactics.
Don't worry, we'll be doing it again in a few months. So
yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I'm just curious, you've helped us understand a lot about mid-year changes and operational plans. If you were to talk to a revenue operations leader who's like new in their role, what type of advice would you give them?
I think the biggest thing that has helped my team is transparency. Because for me, the reason why transparency and communication is so important is because there's a reason why these people are on your team. You, as a RevOps organization, have a lot of things going on, and these people are experts in what they do. And so by giving them transparency and communicating frequently, you're essentially enabling your team to be able to make effective decisions, to be able to think about other considerations, because most likely, being a RevOps team, the types of personalities, the mindset is one where you're thinking about like the thing that you have to do, but you're also kind of thinking about impacts and dependencies. The operational teams are great in that way, right? It's a pro and a con, right? Because also they'll be like, oh my gosh, this could impact these things. And it's like, okay, well, let's kind of dial that back and just focus on, moving forward. But that the ability for them to have that knowledge as quickly as possible so they can navigate things on their own is so powerful. And it allows them a little bit of autonomy and independence in being able to do what they do best. It also builds trust. And so when you go through operational planning, especially for a new RevOps leader, you may not know what you're going to get yourself into, and that's okay, because we all have firsts, right? The first time we ever had to put a budget together, the first time we had to hire someone. But I think if you're transparent and you're getting that information in terms of, ooh, it seems like we might need to adjust what we're doing with sales. Your sales ops manager is going to say, oh, okay, I actually have some ideas, and I was talking to so-and-so, or I'm going to talk to this other person because I want to get some information. And so they're going to help you as a new RevOps leader be more effective in operational planning, because you're communicating what you're trying to accomplish, and they're going to give you so much more back. So that's my biggest advice. Just trust your team and leverage them, because they are there to support you. I would like to say that everything that happens within RevOps is because of me. That is absolutely not true. It is because my team is amazing, and I trust them, and I give them the information they need to work effectively, and I give them the tools that they need in order to be able to accomplish what they need to accomplish, and they never fail. And so I feel fortunate that I can leverage them. And so if you're a new RevOps leader, leverage your team. One caveat to that comment is that obviously if you're a RevOps leader of one, as in you are maybe the first RevOps leader, or maybe you're a very small team, maybe you're one of two or one of three, it is a little tougher. But I think in those cases, when you are a person of one or you're a person of two, I think the biggest thing that can build bridges is vulnerability, and saying, I'm new to this and I want to make this successful. Hey, sales leader, what have you gone through this before? Oh, you have. Great. What are your tips? What are your guidances? And then taking that information. Or on the flip side, your sales leader might say, actually, I've never gone through operational planning, but I'd love to like work with you on making this successful. So I think vulnerability, especially if you're a smaller RevOps team, is a great tactic because again, it's okay to say, I don't know what I'm doing. We can't possibly know everything that we need to do, but I think again, it's going to reinforce those relationships. It's really going to show that people see you as someone who is open to change, open to collaboration, someone who is really looking to solve a problem rather than, kind of be a blocker or create more process when there isn't one. You are really open to making things successful.
Love that.
The thing that's been so interesting about being in RevOps is that this isn't really on the topic of operational planning, but I think it's tangential in the sense that one of the things that's tough in being in RevOps is that a lot of times you have that special skill of looking at the details, but then also looking at the 10,000-foot view. You can really kind of navigate both levels. And so when you think about maybe someone in another area like sales, they might very much be looking at the 100-foot level because they're seeing those ops, they're seeing those leads that they need to convert, and all of those things. And you're able to kind of float between those two very different levels. And so one of the things that I've come across this week as being challenging is, how do you create a narrative? How do you create that story so that when you're at this 10,000-foot level and seeing a little bit further into the future, how do you get people to understand why you're making the decisions that you're doing, or why you're raising your hand around some particular project, or why you're advocating for something that people who might be at the 100-foot level may not necessarily see yet. They will, but they're not there yet. And so I think that's an interesting topic that I've been noodling on this week, because it is something that is unique to RevOps, where you are in this very fortunate position where you can be kind of in two different places, and you do have to oftentimes balance that, but it can be really difficult because if you're seeing something that someone isn't yet, how do you effectively communicate that so that people can be, meet you where you are? And so I think that might be an interesting future topic for your podcast, because it is something that, again, it's hard to navigate.